There's a specific, disorienting silence that falls over an Australian traveller when they're standing in a diner in Ohio or a fish and chip shop in London and they ask for the one thing that makes sense to them. They ask for chicken salt. And the person behind the counter just stares at them. For the last 40 years, millions of Australians have operated under a collective delusion. We grow up believing that this fluorescent neon yellow dust is a fundamental constant of the universe. We assume that if you order hot chips or French fries anywhere on Earth, you'll be offered that binary choice, plain salt or chicken salt. But as thousands of travelers discover every year, chicken salt is a geographic anomaly. It's a condiment that managed to conquer an entire continent, embedding itself into the national palate so deeply that we put it on everything from roast dinners to dim sims, yet it failed completely to cross the ocean. To the rest of the world, the concept is baffling. When they hear the name, they assume it's a literal attempt to dehydrate a bird. As one confused internet user put it, they spent a long time trying to figure out how to make salt out of chickens. But here, it's not a joke. It's the secret ingredient in the country's best-selling rotisserie chickens. It's the dust that coats the bottom of the paper bag on a Friday night. And it's a flavor profile that's savory, slightly sweet, undeniably yellow, and impossible to replicate with standard pantry samples. So, how did this happen? How did a random experiment in a chaotic chicken shop in a small South Australian town become such a big deal? Why is it that this specific mix of spices managed to lock down the Australian fast food market so tightly that plain salt became the alternative option? And perhaps the most contentious question of all, does this chicken salt actually contain any chicken? To understand the invention of chicken salt, you have to understand the culinary landscape of South Australia in the early 1970s. This was an era before the dominance of multinational fast food chains. McDonald's had only just arrived in the country, and the food culture was local, greasy, and it was driven by the independent corner store. In the town of Gawler, about 40 kilometers north of Adelaide, a man named Peter Brinkworth was running a small empire of poultry. He owned a wholesale frozen food business and a retail chicken shop. Peter Brinkworth wasn't a food scientist by any stretch of the term. He wasn't a chef trying to revolutionize Australian cuisine or anything like that. He was just a business owner trying to save some time. In the early 1970s, the process of preparing a chicken for the rotisserie was incredibly inefficient. You had to take the fresh bird and season it by hand using a half dozen different containers. You'd then shake on the salt, shake on the pepper, then you'd add paprika, then maybe some garlic powder or onion powder or celery salt. It was a slow, repetitive process that happened hundreds of times a week. Brinkworth looked at this assembly line of shakers and decided it was, in his own words, a bit silly. He wanted a single blend. He wanted one bucket that he could reach into, grab a handful of seasoning, and coat the bird in one motion. It needed to provide the saltiness for flavor, the savory depth to complement the meat, and the color to ensure the skin roasted to an appetizing brown rather than a pale gray. So he went into the back of the shop and started mixing. The recipe he developed was what he called a simple, natural thing, but it was chemically brilliant. He mixed salt with onion powder, garlic powder, celery salt, and paprika. The paprika was essential. It provided the reddish-orange hue that would eventually become the product's trademark. He also added chicken bouillon, actual dehydrated chicken stock, and monosodium glutamate, or MSG. In the 1970s, MSG was recognized for being a flavor bomb. It provided the glutamate hit found naturally in tomatoes and cheese, amplifying the savory notes of the chicken fat as it rendered down. Brinkworth called his creation chicken salt for the most literal reason possible. It was salt intended for chickens. It was never actually meant to be a product for the public. Rather, it was an industrial efficiency hack, a tool to make his staff's life easier and his chickens taste consistent. But Brinkworth also ran a wholesale business. He supplied fresh and frozen chickens to fish and chip shops and other takeaway joints throughout the northern suburbs, places like Elizabeth and Salisbury. When he delivered the birds, he started bringing along small bags of his pre-mixed salt so the shop owners could season the chickens themselves before putting them onto their own spits. It was a value-add service. Then, one of his wholesale customers in Salisbury, a fish and chip shop owner, took the bag of orange powder intended for the rotisserie birds and sprinkled it over a batch of hot chips fresh out of the fryer. He tasted it, he paused, and then he told Brinkworth, this is good." This was the light bulb moment. The chemistry that allowed the salt to bond the rendering fat of a roasting chicken worked even better when bonding it with the hot vegetable oil of a deep-fried potato. The sugar in the onion and garlic powders caramelized slightly, the MSG triggered the savory receptors, and the salt cut through the grease. It was addictive, to say the least. Brinkworth realized he had something that was far more than just a kitchen shortcut. He started packaging it and selling it in small, unbranded jars to the fish and chip shops he supplied. He didn't even have a logo yet, but he had a product that people in the northern suburbs of Adelaide just couldn't stop eating. It spread through word of mouth among small business owners. One shop would start using it, their chips would taste better, and the shop down the road would have to scramble to find out why. But Peter Brinkworth was a retailer, not a manufacturer. His focus was on his shop and his wholesale deliveries. Mixing spices in bulk is a dusty, difficult logistical challenge, and as the 1970s came to a close, the demand for this chicken salt was beginning to outstrip his ability to produce it in a back room. While Peter Brinkworth was experimenting in Gawler, another family was building a different kind of food legacy in South Australia. Elia and Trianka Mitani had arrived in Australia in 1954. Like many migrants of that era, they came with a young child, their son Tass, and a desperate work ethic. They started with a market garden, growing the produce that fed the state before progressing into food retailing. By the late 1970s, the Mitani family had established themselves as innovators in the South Australian food scene. They'd moved from growing food to selling it, and finally to manufacturing it. They were looking for products that could be scaled, products that could move beyond a single storefront and into the national supply chain. In 1979, the paths of Peter Brinkworth and the Mitani family crossed as Brinkworth was looking to sell his business and the Mitani family was looking to buy. The sale of the business in 1979 included the recipe for chicken salt. Brinkworth would eventually move on to other things. For the Mitani group, however, it was the beginning of an empire. The Mitani family recognized that they had acquired something unique, but they also recognized that for this product to work on a mass scale, it had to evolve. They pioneered the commercial production of chicken salt. They took it out of the plastic bags and unbranded jars of the wholesale trade and gave it a professional identity. They developed the distinctive packaging that would eventually become a familiar sight in pantries across the state. But their most critical move was embedding the product into the industrial food supply chain of Australia. Mitani wanted to sell salt to the companies that sold food to you. They built relationships with major food manufacturers and quick service restaurant chains. This is a crucial distinction in the business history of the product. If Mitani had focused solely on selling small shakers to households, chicken salt might have remained a novelty item. By targeting the wholesale distributors, they ensured that chicken salt became the flavor foundation for millions of meals. They became the secret ingredient in the stuffing mixes used by major poultry brands. They supplied the seasoning that went onto the rotisserie chickens sold in the major supermarkets, and they provided the dust that coated the chips at fast food franchises. By the early 1980s, the transition was well underway. The product had become a South Australian staple and was beginning its march across the rest of the country. The Mitani family invested heavily in manufacturing technologies, guaranteeing consistency for corporate clients who demanded that every single chip tasted exactly the same. This industrialization locked the flavor in, and once the big players, like the supermarket chains and the fast food franchises, adopted chicken salt as their standard seasoning, it became very difficult for any other flavor profile to compete. White table salt, which had been the standard for centuries, was suddenly relegated to second place. It was the boring option, the option you chose if you were on a diet or if you didn't know any better. But as the business grew, so did the scrutiny. As the product moved from the back of a chicken shop to the shelves of Coles and Woolies, it had to face the changing attitudes of the Australian consumer. The 1980s and 90s brought new fears about food additives, new dietary requirements, and a growing suspicion of chemical-sounding ingredients like MSG. Regardless, by the 1990s, chicken salt had firmly established itself as the standard seasoning in Australian takeaway shops. Thousands of independent businesses adopted the yellow dust as their default option, fundamentally changing customer expectations across the country. In the mid-2000s, this dominance caused a minor culture war. The default had shifted so heavily that if you walked into a shop and wanted plain white table salt on your chips, you had to specifically ask for it, and even then, you were fighting a losing battle. In 2009, a writer named Deborah Brown captured this phenomenon in a piece for the Sydney Morning Herald. She described her local charcoal chicken shop as a haven for the couldn't-be-buggered cooking demographic, but lamented that it had been ruined by the evil, yellow-tinted aberration of chicken salt. She recounted a specific incident where she clearly enunciated, "Large chips with normal salt, please," and she watched the shop assistant, who she dubbed Chicken Boy, nod, pull the chips from the fryer, and then automatically douse them in the yellow dust anyway. When she complained, Chicken Boy offered a solution that defied the laws of physics. He said, "I'll just fry the chicken salt off them," and threw the seasoned chips back into the oil. This anecdote is pretty hilarious, but it illustrates a serious commercial reality. To the staff working the fryers, chicken salt had become the baseline. It was the standard operating procedure, whereas white salt was the deviation. It was the abnormal request. So we have a product that's beloved, ubiquitous, and commercially dominant in a developed Western nation. In almost any other industry, this is the precursor to global expansion. You'd expect to see Matani jars on shelves in a Walmart in Texas or a Tesco in London. But you don't. So why didn't chicken salt go global? Why does it remain an Aussie-only seasoning? The answer lies in a combination of bad timing, entrenched competition, and a confusing name. First, we have to look at the competitive landscape of the international salt market. While Australia was falling in love with Peter Brinkworth's invention, the rest of the world had their own default seasonings. In the United States, the category of seasoned salt was already owned by a giant, Lawry's. Developed in the 1930s for seasoning steaks, Lawry's had a 40-year head start on chicken salt. By the 1970s, it was the entrenched incumbent in the American pantry. In the United Kingdom, the city of Hull had developed its own regional obsession called chip spice, a paprika and salt-based seasoning introduced in the 1970s inspired by American diners. And in Europe, Knorr's Aromat, a yellow MSG-heavy seasoning, occupied the same culinary niche. Chicken salt was a regional variant of a crowded category. To displace Lawry's or Old Bay, an Australian company would have needed a massive marketing budget and a compelling reason for Americans to switch. This brings us to the second problem, the name. Chicken salt is a marketing nightmare for an export product. To an Australian who grew up with it, we don't think too much about it, but to a foreigner encountering it for the first time, the name implies that the product is made of chicken. In the United States, consumers are often baffled by the concept. They ask if it's salt made from chickens or salt for chickens. There was even a genuine belief among some that it was chicken skin flakes, which then led it to being called chook dandruff. In an era of increasing concern about animal byproducts, a salt that sounds like it contains pulverized poultry faces a significant branding hurdle, to say the least. It requires an explanation before you can even get the customer to taste it. Finally, there's the structure of the business itself. Matani and the other Australian manufacturers were focused on domestic saturation. They were family-owned businesses supplying local logistics networks. They weren't global conglomerates with the infrastructure to force a new flavor profile onto international shelves. The export market was never the primary goal. The goal was to be the secret ingredient in every roast chicken sold in Woolies, and they achieved that. The result is a closed loop. Chicken salt exists in Australia because the infrastructure of the takeaway shops supported it. It doesn't exist elsewhere because those markets had different infrastructures and different defaults. This brings us to the great modern controversy of chicken salt, the debate that divides purists from casual fans. What is actually in that yellow dust? Well, if you ask Peter Brinkworth about the mixture he created in that Gawler shop in the 1970s, the answer is clear. The original recipe contained salts, chicken bouillon, MSG, paprika, garlic, onion, and celery. It was a savory, meaty, umami-rich blend designed to make rotisserie birds taste incredible. But if you walk into a Coles or Woolies today and pick up a jar of the market-leading Mitani chicken salt, the ingredient list tells a very different story. Modern Mitani chicken salt contains no chicken. It's suitable for vegetarians, it's gluten-free, and perhaps most significantly, the label loudly states no added MSG. So how did chicken salt become a vegan, MSG-free product? The shift reflects the changing anxieties of the Australian consumer over the last 30 years. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a wave of MSG hysteria swept the Western world. Despite a lack of concrete scientific evidence proving it was harmful to the general population, the additive E621 became a pariah. No MSG became a powerful marketing claim that brands needed to display to survive. Manufacturers like Mitani had to adapt. They removed the pure monosodium glutamate, and in its place, they often substituted yeast extract, a natural source of glutamates that provides a similar savory umami hit, but looks friendlier on the label. They also removed the chicken. This was likely a combination of cost, shelf stability, and the desire to broaden the market. By making the product vegetarian and halal certified, they ensured that chicken salt could be eaten by almost anyone, regardless of dietary restrictions. Peter Brinkworth, now in his 80s, still makes the original recipe in his home kitchen. He uses the chicken bouillon, he uses the MSG, and he maintains that his version tastes better than the commercial variations because it stays true to that original flavor bomb concept. He even sells it via an honesty box near his home in Adelaide, keeping the original flame alive while the industrial version conquers the supermarket shelves. The story of chicken salt is rarely discussed as a business case study, but it should be. It's a perfect example of path dependence, the economic theory that explains why we keep using QWERTY keyboards or why train tracks are a specific width. Once a standard is set, once the default is established, it becomes incredibly difficult to dislodge. In the case of Australian fast food, Peter Brinkworth set the standard in the 1970s because he was tired of using 5 different shakers. The Mitani family locked that standard in by building an industrial supply chain that made it easier for shop owners to buy the yellow dust than to mix their own. The result is a culinary monopoly that exists almost nowhere else in the world. Today, the legacy of that decision is visible in the sheer cultural weight the product carries. It's moved beyond being just a condiment. It's become a signifier of identity. We see this in the way it's being reclaimed and elevated. In New York, Australian expats have opened cafes that serve high-end versions of the salt. In Melbourne, trendy bars have experimented with chicken salt margaritas. It's even entered the world of high art, or at least the film festival circuit. In 2022, the documentary Salt of the Earth premiered at the Adelaide Film Festival. It was also screened in Egypt, the Czech Republic, France, and the United States, winning Best International Documentary at a festival in Florida. For Peter Brinkworth, the man who started it all, this late-stage fame is baffling. He's an octogenarian who spends his time making jam. When his grandson told him recently that he was a national icon, Brinkworth just laughed. To him, it was just the way to season a chicken. But his grandson was right. If Brinkworth hadn't sold the recipe to Mitani in 1979, or if Mitani had decided to focus on oregano instead, the default taste of the Australian childhood would be completely different. Instead, because of one transaction 40 years ago, an entire continent is addicted to a savory, yellow, vegetarian chicken salt. But what do you think? Is chicken salt the greatest seasoning on earth? Are there any weirdos here who didn't like it growing up? And for the international viewers, if you've tried it, did it live up to the hype? Or did it just taste like salty soup mix? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching and stay curious.